Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the Nativity the way it really would have happened, and that is because the traditional nativity story, the one that we hear every year, unfortunately, in our churches and in our schools, in our nativity plays, is in fact Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance, again, to the way it really would have happened. So, as I am very fond of saying here, let's open your eyes, open your ears, open your mind, open your Bibles, because maybe the nativity doesn't look like we think it does, and that we are frankly required to rescue truth from familiarity. Now, if you appreciate content like this, please make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to my show, my website, as well as the Truth Be Told radio network site, which, of course, if you want to listen to the Truth Be Told radio network, there's many different ways of doing that. Of course, you can go straight to their website at www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, where you can listen to any show on their network simply by clicking on the big listen button. But of course, you can also listen on any smart device. Now, smart device, of course, includes your phone, but that also means Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices, and a variety of applications: Android app, MyTuner, Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn radio, and of course, we are also now available as a podcast. So if you go to Anchor or Spotify or Audible, you can find the Truth Be Told radio network and God Save the King available as a podcast. So we're really excited to have you here today. I'm excited about what we're going to talk about today, because frankly, it's really one of the highlights of God Save the King and telling the nativity story the way it really would have happened, because we're going to fill in some blanks today that are very typically left out of the traditional nativity story, because we don't talk about the history. We don't talk about the history that surrounds the story, and that is what makes this story really, truly come alive. As I have talked about in past episodes, this is an epic story. This is not a small-scale story. Sure, Joseph and Mary, that's very micro, that's very, personal, very personal, and we've talked about that. It's a very, very personal story for them, and they play a huge role in a huge story, but their particular story is kind of small scale, because it's about Joseph and Mary getting betrothed. And then Joseph takes off to go build the chuppah, as you would in a Hebrew betrothal and marriage, right? But then while he's away building the chuppah, this major thing happens, that Mary is visited by an angel that tells her, oh yeah, by the way, the power of the Holy Ghost is going to overcome you, and you, even though you're a virgin who has never known a man, you're going to conceive a child, and that child is going to be born, and that child is going to be the promised one who was promised to save Israel. So yeah, that's kind of a big deal, a little bit, that is really, really a big deal, but it takes place with these two young people. It's highly doubtful that Mary was more than 20 years old, and despite tradition, here we go again, despite tradition, most likely Joseph was only I don't think he was more than maybe 25 max. I think he was probably in his early 20s, 21, 22, something like that. I do not believe the proto-evangelium of James that tells us that Joseph was older and a widower. I think that is 100% fiction, because I don't believe you can trust the proto-evangelium of James at all. 0%. Okay. It is so inaccurate in so many ways about so many facts that we do know. Okay. That when it comes to a fact that maybe is true, but is speculative, I don't think you can trust it at all. and culturally, there's so much wrong with the proto-evangelium of James. Wow, just amazing. But that's another story for another day and another time. We have been spending a significant amount of time looking at the background of these unique characters known as the Magi, right? So we've spent several weeks. This is if you're watching this on YouTube, you will see that this is entitled "The History of the Magi, Part 6." Okay, so that means we've spent 6 hours talking about the Magi. Now we're going to talk about the Magi today, but now we're going to start to put the pieces together even more so than we've already done before, right? Last week, I had a lot of fun last week because I managed to get a map up on screen share and was able to show you guys geographically how a lot of these pieces come together. Because, like I said, this is an international epic. You have the two superpowers of their day and time, the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire, let alone, I won't go there today, the Kushan Empire and then the Han Dynasty of China. Those are major powers that actually factor into the story a little bit, right? But you've definitely got the two major superpowers of their day, Rome and Parthia, finally coming into contact. It required the disillusionment of the dissolving, right, of the Seleucid Empire that was a buffer in between the two of them before they came into contact physically and actually had warfare between the two of them. But as I have pointed out in several episodes, that doesn't mean that there wasn't international relations, that there wasn't foreign affairs going on between these nations and these countries, because of course there were. A lot of times when we approach the traditional nativity story, we act as if these wise men showed up completely unannounced, that we had no idea who they were or why they were there or anything like that. And it's the total opposite would have been true. The known world would have known who the Magi were. That's what makes the story so amazing, is they would have known who these guys were. They would have known what their job description was, and therefore why it was such a big deal when in the Gospel of Matthew and they show up at the court of Herod the Great. Scripture tells us that Herod was greatly troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Okay, now we're going to talk about Herod tonight, but here's a little advance tip about Herod. Herod was an extraordinarily shrewd politician. Okay, very shrewd politician. Like I said, we're going to talk about that a little bit with regard to the backstory between Herod and the Parthians. Is that this Herod knew who the Parthians were. You're going to find out big time here in just a minute when we start talking about that. Herod knew who the Parthians were. Herod knew who the Magi were. Herod had foreign relations, foreign affairs with the Parthians. Okay? He knew who they were, and he would have known a couple of days in advance who they were. Certainly by the time the Parthians hit Damascus on their trek to visit Judea, advance riders either of Herod's network or of the Parthians would have gone and announced themselves. You know, if their intentions were peaceful, they very likely would have sent advance riders saying, hey, we're bringing an ambassadorial entourage to your royal court to visit. And yes, we have military escort because that's how this is done. But, we have, we don't intend to start a fight at all right now. But still, if you're bringing several thousand man army into foreign territory, into Roman territory, yeah, you might be a little bit concerned. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's back up. And as my manner is, let's back up and let's get a running start. And let's talk about the history that sets the stage for Herod and the Parthians. Now, one of the things we talked about last week is we talked about how after Alexander the Great conquered the known world, but then died at a young age, his empire was divided up amongst his strongest generals, right? And the two that mattered the most were Ptolemy, who became the governor of Egypt, okay, and instituted the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, and then Seleucus, or the Seleucid dynasty. And the Seleucid dynasty controlled the Levant and the Middle East and all the way to Central Asia, and a little bit of India. But the Seleucid Empire was so huge that it didn't take very long when the different geographic and ethnic divisions within their empire began to break away from Seleucid rule and declare their independence. And one of the first locations to do this was a province at the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea called Parthia. And then it would have extended up the eastern side of the Caspian Sea a little bit into Central Asia. As a matter of fact, let's bust out the map and we'll take a look here, right? So you should be able to see my cursor on the map here. All right, let's go back. That you should, like I said, you should be able to see my cursor on the map. Let's try this. We do that. Yeah, there we go. There we go. So yeah, so you can see my cursor on the map, okay? So over here, the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea is where the province of Parthia was. Now, the province was a little bigger than the circle I just drew. The province actually extended up here into Turkmenistan and came down around here about like this. That would have been the province of Parthia. Now, the province of Parthia had a Hellenic Greek overlord, but then he was overthrown by the local Parni tribe, okay? A man named Arsaces. Arsaces the First overthrew the Greek overlord and declared their independence, and therefore instituted the Arsacid dynasty of the Parthian Empire. And then the Parthians would have moved steadily westward for the next couple of hundred years, right? So they were claiming territory, getting it back from the Hellenic Greeks. And then meanwhile, coming in from over here, coming in from Europe and from the Mediterranean, moving through this way would have been the Roman Empire. So as the Romans are moving in from the west, as the Parthians are moving to the west, the Seleucid Empire that is in this area here is beginning to disintegrate. It's beginning to fall apart, and they are losing control of this once vast area of land, right? And then in the middle of the 2nd century BC, the teeny little kingdom of Judea, which would have been right about where my cursor was, and frankly, not much bigger than my cursor. If you see my cursor right there, that's all the bigger it would have been. They managed to declare their independence from the Seleucids as well. Now, the story of Jewish independence, we are going to save the details for another day because it deserves, I mean, it's frankly is a big part of our story and it deserves our attention. But I will say this much right now. It was a family known as either the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, right? They overthrew Greek Seleucid rule in the middle of the 2nd century BC, right around 170 to 165 BC. We're not precisely sure exactly which year it started. Scholars differ a little bit on that. Some say 165, some say 167, some even say as early as 171. Off the top of my head, I think it's the 167 date that is probably the most correct. But at any rate, it was a Jewish priestly family took great offense at being required to offer an unclean sacrifice, which is something the Greeks were making them do. We talked about this last week that because of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, you now actually had a very large and significant Jewish population outside the Bible land. And they were treated much differently than the Jewish population within the Bible land. So when the Jews outside the Promised Land came in contact with this very cosmopolitan Hellenic Greek culture, plus these other cultures, right? Because they're bumping elbows not just with the Greeks, but with the Parthians, with the Babylonians, with the Assyrians, and with all these different ethnicities that are now a part of, Alexander's former empire, right? They didn't do so bad. They were able to, what's the word I want to use? Frankly, be a little more tolerant of what other people believed so that people would be a little more tolerant of them. Whereas the Jews in the Bible lands were very zealous. And as a matter of fact, this is a critical point to understanding our story and understanding why we call it God Save the King, is because there is little question that Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was the Seleucid king, who was the most offensive to the Jews in the Bible lands. He was far and away the most offensive. There is little argument. It is, frankly, it's impossible to argue that he was an arch Hellenist. In other words, he was an absolute zealot for advancing Hellenism. There was no room for anybody else to believe anything other than that what they wanted to impose upon them. So he was an arch Hellenist, and he frankly was a religious and an ethnic bigot. There is really no question about it. And he hated the Jews. He really put the screws to them. He basically made practicing Judaism illegal. But like I said, this is really another story for another time, because then the Maccabees took particular offense one day and started a revolt, started a revolution, and threw off Seleucid rule. And this is the origins of the cleansing of the temple and the Feast of Hanukkah. And like I said, we'll spend more time another day getting into that story, because it's extremely relevant to what's going on here. But like I said a second ago, a piece of this puzzle that is actually quite important revolves around the fact that it was the underlying reasons for the revolution. Okay. So on one hand, it was simply a foreign occupying power. And that's very easy to understand. That's no big mystery. Overthrowing a foreign occupying power is as old as the hills. That goes back to time immemorial, where one country is under the thumb of another country and they just can't take it anymore and they overthrow foreign rule. Okay. So that's pretty simple to understand. But the inner workings of this, okay, are a little trickier, right? Now, I can share it with you in a relatively simple formula, but they're a little bit trickier, which is that it wasn't just the Hellenizing Greeks that the Jews had a problem with. It was the Hellenizing Jews that the Jews had a problem with, because Judaism, by definition, is an exclusive religion. Right? Judaism says there is one God and there is no other God. We worship the one true God, Yahweh, and all y'all, you don't, right? It's exclusive, it's exclusivistic, and it is zealous, okay? It is zealous. So it's very interesting that it was the conservative Jews who wanted to maintain religious purity. They'd had it up to here with their Hellenizing brothers, the Hellenizing Jews, who wanted to work with the Hellenizing Greeks at making the culture more cosmopolitan, of, tolerance and things like that. And frankly, what they wanted to do was tolerate things that the Jewish religion saw as repugnant, okay? And not just repugnant to the people, but thereby repugnant to God. So the reason I bring this up is because it wasn't as simple as overthrowing a foreign power. Jewish rebellions, and we see this later, even though it's not a part of our story, when you go forward in history and you get to the revolts against the Romans, okay, in in the 60s AD, and then again around 135 AD, when the Jews revolted against the Romans, we see these same underlying features, which is that there was always a component of civil war inside. Within the bigger context, there was a civil war. So there was a civil war going on within Judea between the conservative religionists and then the liberal religionists who wanted to go, oh, can't we all just get along? And it's okay that they're sacrificing pigs in the temple and stuff like that. So this was a big deal, was this civil war that was going on, not just simply overthrowing a foreign power. So at any rate, the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, they overthrow the Syrians. And for the first several decades after the overthrow, they were very religiously pure, they were very conservative, and they wanted to restore, Judaism to the kingdom of Judah and pure Judaism, right? But then once you get about 3 or 4 rulers down the line from the first Maccabean ruler, right? When you get to the reign of John Hyrcanus was very expansionist. He really truly believed that he was chosen by God to restore the Davidic kingdom. So he expanded the kingdom, often by the sword and often by forcible conversion to Judaism. So that's kind of interesting, because all of a sudden now the Jews are starting to take on some of the characteristics that they didn't like. Okay, they're starting to become more cosmopolitan. They're starting to become more worldly. They're starting to expand their kingdom for worldly reasons. They're using the sword to do it. They're forcibly converting other peoples to their religion and saying, you got to do it the way we say, right? And then after John Hyrcanus came Alexander Jannaeus. And Alexander Jannaeus, his reign was also extremely turbulent, right? Very expansionist, overcame several neighboring regions to bring them into the kingdom of Judea, and again, forcible conversion. And then when he died, his wife reigned in his stead, in his place, Alexandra Salome. And so there, check this out, you've got a queen of Israel in the 1st century BC. Now, part of the reason she reigned in Alexander's place is because she had 2 sons, but they were not old enough to take the throne yet. But in a classic case of sibling rivalry and Game of Thrones, I mean, this is the real Game of Thrones, folks, right here. This is really it. Her 2 sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, fought a civil war for the throne of Judea, right? Hyrcanus was the elder brother and therefore technically should have inherited the throne, inherited the high priesthood, but Aristobulus, the younger brother, frankly might have been maybe a better leader, maybe, hard to say, right? And he sure wanted to be. He felt that he would be a better leader. But the shortened version, because I want to get to Herod. I want to get to Herod. I don't want to run out of time and not get to our understanding of Herod here. Herod and the Parthians. Okay, this is the history of the Magi, part 6. Herod and the Parthians, right? So Hyrcanus and Aristobulus engage in a civil war, right? The throne trades hands a couple of times. Finally, Hyrcanus gets to the place where he's like, and this is costing them lives and treasure. This is costing Judean lives and Judean money, and they're fighting amongst themselves. So finally, Hyrcanus gets to this place where he says, oh my God, we just can't keep doing this. We just cannot keep doing this. So what does he do? But he appeals to the Romans for military aid. So now at that time, the Roman general Pompey was already campaigning on the eastern end of the Mediterranean against what they would have called pirates, which just means any enemy disrupting maritime trade any trade that happened by ship that was being disrupted by anybody, they were the enemy of Rome, and the Roman army and the Roman navy was going to go after them and destroy them. So Pompey was already in the Eastern Mediterranean, campaigning against pirates, quote unquote, in the area. So when Hyrcanus appealed to him for military aid, he was like, okay, let's go. Now, a critical component of this equation is that Hyrcanus did not appeal to Pompey directly. It was a court official in Hyrcanus's court that appealed to Pompey, and his name was Antipater. Now, Antipater was an Idumean. Now, if you do your background, you'll discover that Idumea is the Latinized form of the word Edom. Okay, so Antipater was an Edomite, and the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. So go back to the book of Genesis, do your homework, and look up the story of Jacob and Esau and how they were the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah, and that, when they were being born, one stuck his arm out, and they, the midwife put a ribbon around his arm, and then his arm came back in, and then the other one came out, and all this nonsense. And there was a fight over the right of primogeniture. Who was the eldest son, who is therefore going to have the inheritance? And then we know the story how Jacob deceived Esau over a bowl of soup to sell him his birthright and the whole thing. And God did not take too kindly to that. Ironically, not so much with Jacob, but with Esau. He was not happy about the fact that Esau so willingly sold his birthright. So you have records throughout the Old Testament saying, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. So this is a descendant of Esau. This is an Edomite. This is an Idumean. This is Antipater, right? And Idumea was one of the localities that was forcibly converted to Judaism by John Hyrcanus. Okay? Now that's very important. Forcibly converted. But now here is Antipater, right? Becomes a court official in the court of Hyrcanus II. He becomes extremely influential, and it's actually Antipater that appeals to the Romans and convinces the Romans to intervene on Hyrcanus's behalf against his brother Aristobulus. Okay, so this is what occurs in 63 BC. Pompey invades Judea, and after, I think it's a 3 or 4 month siege, conquers Jerusalem. He goes into the temple, the whole thing. There's a lot of hubbub about that, but he confirms Hyrcanus as the high priest. Now, I forget the exact timeline, but once Hyrcanus is confirmed as the high priest and, frankly, the king, the client king of Judea for the Romans, a rift starts to develop between Hyrcanus and Antipater, right? Antipater is still Hyrcanus's official, so at least in theory, he's got to work on Hyrcanus's behalf. But Hyrcanus begins to consolidate power by appealing to his countrymen, by appealing to the Judeans and saying, hey, this is good for our country, this is good for our religion, et cetera, right? But Antipater starts to consolidate his position by appealing to the Romans. So it's several years later, I forget exactly what the timeline is, Antipater convinces the Romans to do away with the title and office of client king and appoint a procurator. Okay, so this actually is the first time that Judea comes under direct Roman control, is when they appoint Antipater the procurator of Judea, right? Not Hyrcanus, Antipater, right? Hyrcanus remains high priest, but Antipater becomes the procurator of Judea. And what Antipater does is that in turn, he appoints his 2 sons, Faisal and Herod, as governors of Jerusalem and Galilee. Faisal gets Jerusalem. Herod gets Galilee. And Herod is like 26 or 28 years old when he declares him to be governor of Galilee, right? So you can see the political maneuvering that is going on here. And this, like I said before, this really is Game of Thrones because Aristobulus is taken prisoner to Rome, but he eventually escapes, and his son Antigonus comes back and makes war with Hyrcanus and actually manages to retake the throne again. And there's more civil war, and it goes back and forth again. But if we fast forward in history, and this is where I want to get to, because this is a critical component of our story. This, frankly, is why this is called God Save the King, right? Because jumping ahead, we know that Herod is a tyrant, and Herod is frankly paranoid about protecting his throne, right? So now we are going to come to the place where we understand Herod and the Parthians. Because, like I said, Pompey conquers Jerusalem. At first, he appoints Hyrcanus, a client king of Judea, and Antipater is his court official. But then after a while, Antipater persuades the Romans. It's actually, I think it's Julius Caesar at this point, because I think it's after the Civil War between Pompey and Caesar. So now Caesar is in charge, I think. Okay. It's tough to keep the dates and timeline straight sometimes. But I think they appeal to Caesar, and then Caesar appoints him procurator of Judea, right? And then, like I said, he appoints Herod governor of Galilee and Faisal governor of Jerusalem, right? But then you have Caesar gets assassinated. Power changes hands in Rome, okay? Power changes hands in Rome, and the second triumvirate comes into power. So the second triumvirate would be Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. And of course, they divide up the empire for who gets to control what. And Antony gets put in charge of the East, quote unquote. Okay, the Roman East. So Antony is now the new ruler of this area. And Antony confirms, and also Antipater gets assassinated. So like I said, this really is Game of Thrones. This really is God Save the King, because you've got kings and officials and princes and stuff, just killing each other and dying left and right. You got Caesar getting assassinated. You got Antipater getting assassinated, right? So Antony, okay, and there's more to this. I mean, there's much, much more to this. I mean, when Caesar was in Egypt, Antipater came to his rescue at the siege of Alexandria and the Battle of the Nile. Okay, I mean, come on, he brought a Jewish army, okay, down to Egypt to aid Julius Caesar, right? So no wonder Julius Caesar had no problem confirming Antipater and his sons with the roles that they had. And then after Antipater gets assassinated, he reconfirms Herod and Faisal. And ironically, Hyrcanus is still the high priest through all of this. But now we get to the critical point, and the critical point is 40 BC. Because in 40 BC, a son of Aristobulus II, and therefore nephew of Hyrcanus II, named Antigonus has gone off to the Parthians and appealed to them for military aid. So now the Parthians come in with a full-blown invasion, okay, and they take Judea from the Judeans, not so much from the Romans, okay, because Judea is being administrated for the Romans by Antipater and his sons, and you don't have Roman legions garrisoned in Judea at this time. And even though Antipater is, quote unquote, a procurator, right, for the Romans, like I said, you don't have Roman legions in Judea. So it's not the Parthians defeating the Romans. The Romans are all garrisoned a little bit too far north in Syria to make a difference. Plus, the Romans have had their nose bloodied by the Parthians a couple of times now. And so the Parthians come in and they take Judea from not Antipater anymore, he's dead, from Faisal and Hyrcanus and Herod. And the way that story goes is that they came in from the north, and the army was in Galilee and then moving south towards Jerusalem. And word came to the leadership that the Parthians were there and were going to take over, right? So it was agreed that Hyrcanus and Faisal would go meet with the Parthians and try to negotiate. And Herod remained in the background just in case everything would go sideways, which it did. Okay. Negotiations with the Parthians, which also meant negotiations with Antigonus, did not go well. Okay. If you read in the works of Josephus, I forget again which it is off the top of my head, whether Faisal was murdered or whether he committed suicide. But either way, Faisal winds up dead. Okay. And then also Antigonus disfigures Hyrcanus by either cutting off his ears or biting off his ears so that he is disfigured, which means he can no longer hold the office of high priest. Okay. Now let's jump back to our map here. Let's get our map back up on screen. Let's screen share here. Okay, so now we're looking at our map again. So the Parthians, who the Parthian Empire is this area all over here, right? Parthian Empire is this all in this area. And what they would have done is they would have brought troops up the Euphrates, and then right in about here, they would have crossed over and dropped down into Judea like this, okay? So by the time they hit Damascus, by the time they hit Galilee, that's when word is getting to Jerusalem that the Parthians have invaded and they're about to take over the country. Hyrcanus and Faisal go to negotiate, and that doesn't work. Herod remains in reserve in case it doesn't work. So Herod at first flees to the Nabateans to try to get aid from them, which doesn't work. And then Herod flees to Alexandria in Egypt because he is already personal friends with Mark Antony. He is personal friends with Mark Antony. So he knows that Mark Antony is in charge of the East. He's in charge of this whole area over here. He's going to be in Alexandria hanging out with Cleopatra. So he goes there to appeal to Mark Antony for Rome to intervene and throw the Parthians out, right? Well, Mark Antony is not there. So Cleopatra puts Herod on a trip and on a ship to Rome. So he goes to Rome. And in Rome, the Romans discover something pretty amazing, which is go back to the, what's the word I want to use? The paradigm and the paradox that we were talking about before, that whenever a foreign power would get involved in the Bible lands, in the Promised Land and the Kingdom of Judea, there was always a civil war component going on as well. So it wasn't just international affairs, foreign affairs, there would be a civil war going on, right? And this is no exception. So what the Romans realized is that the Romans realized, my God, what an amazing opportunity for them to install the proper leader to represent their interests. Because frankly, what they needed was a strong man. They needed a strong man who would go in there and crack the whip and make these rebellious Jews do what they said, right? But foreign powers had a real problem doing that. So even though Herod, as a son of Antipater, was an Idumean, okay, and therefore technically a foreigner after a fashion, he was still a local. He was still a quote-unquote native because Idumea had been forcibly converted to Judaism, been annexed and forcibly converted to Judaism by John Hyrcanus. Okay, so Herod, even though he would come to be looked upon as this half Jew, at least he's better than the Romans, right? So Herod goes to Rome. He meets with Mark Antony. Mark Antony introduces him to Octavian, and then Octavian and Mark Antony take him before the Roman Senate, who declare him to be the Roman client king of the Jews. And this would have been in 40 BC or early 39 BC, 40-ish, 39 BC-ish. Herod is appointed the Roman client king of Judea. But if you've been paying attention, what did I just say? Herod had been driven out by an invasion by the Parthians, who had, of course, reinstalled Antigonus as the high priest and the king, right? So even though the Romans are declaring Herod to be the king of Judea, it's not under Roman control, okay? It is not under Roman control. So the Romans loan Herod several legions to go retake Judea from the Parthians. Now, I need to make a correction here. I don't know where I got this number from in the past, but I've been using it for years, and I came to the realization a little while back that my number was very, very incorrect. Somewhere in the past, I got the number 11 Roman legions, and that just simply is not correct. It was probably 3 or 4 Roman legions, because at this point now, Antony has taken legions to the east. Now they are garrisoned and stationed to the north. They are not garrisoned exactly in Judea. We're not precisely sure, okay? Some records indicate that they may have been garrisoned at least partially in Judea at this point, okay? So if Judea is right in here, right, these Roman legions are garrisoned more up in here. That's where they're garrisoned. But at any rate, the Romans allow Herod to make use of at least 3, maybe even 4 Roman legions, along with his own private army, to retake Judea from the Parthians. And we now have records of which Roman legions these were. It was the 6th, the Ferrata, the ironclad legion, the 3rd legion, which was the Gallica. Those are 2 legions that were originally recruited by Julius Caesar in Gaul. Okay. And then the 3rd and 4th. So you got the 3rd and the 6th, the Gallica and the Ferrata. Then you have the 10th Fretensis legion, and I forget the 4th one off the top of my head, which one that may have been. But these are the legions that most likely got loaned to Herod to take Judea back from the Parthians. So I know I sound like a broken record, but this is extremely important. He's got to take it back from the Parthians. The Romans don't have it to give. So this is what sets the stage for Herod's history with the Parthians and thereby with the Magi. He is going to go to war with the Parthians, and it takes him 2.5 to 3 years to finally drive the Parthians from Judea and secure his throne. And now he is the official Roman client king of Judea. So once he conquers Judea, the legions are given back to Rome, and once again they are now stationed up here. They're stationed up in this area up here on the frontier along the Euphrates River, up and into, from Lebanon through Syria up into what would be modern Turkey. Okay. So by 37 BC, Herod has retaken Judea, and then only about a year later, Mark Antony engages him in his very ill-fated invasion of Parthia, he tries to do an end run. Instead of going straight at him like this, he goes up through Armenia and Azerbaijan and tries to come down like this, right? That's where he tries to go, but he gets he gets defeated pretty soundly by the Parthians, and he's got to tuck tail and run. He engages in one of the worst military blunders of the ancient world, which was a winter retreat through the mountains where he's harassed by the Parthians the whole way. And this was what kind of started to spell the beginning of the end for Mark Antony, and the fact that Octavian would therefore become the ruler of the Romans, about 6 or 8 years later. Okay. So, but once again, Herod was appointed king of Judea by the Romans. He was given 3 or 4 Roman legions, plus his own army to retake Judea from the Parthians. He succeeds in doing that, and then not very long thereafter, Antony tries to invade Parthia, is soundly defeated, and so now you've got Herod, with Mark Antony is still his patron, but he's waning. He's diminishing in his power and his credibility. So now Herod has to rule Judea, right? And he rules Judea from 37 BC to 1 BC, his death in early 1 BC. Now here we got to pick up the story about the Hasmoneans again, because Herod doesn't like the Hasmoneans very much, right? Because he believes the throne is, legitimately his. And therefore these pesky Hasmoneans, right, still think that they're entitled to the throne. Now, part of what makes this so interesting, and once again brings in the God save the king issue here, and the contention over the throne, the game of thrones, once again, is the fact that he married a Hasmonean princess. And he has 2 sons by Mariamne, a Hasmonean princess, which means his 2 sons and his wife and one of his wives, because he married a bunch, his 2 sons and his wife have a more legitimate claim to the throne than he did, because even though they weren't from the right tribe, they weren't from the right Jewish tribe, they were not of the tribe of Judah, because they came from a family of priests, so that presumes they came from the tribe of Levi, not the tribe of Judah. At least they were Jews, and Herod wasn't a Jew. There was not a drop of Judean blood in Herod. He was half Idumean and then half Nabatean, half Arabian, which is another client kingdom of the Romans that occupied this area right in here. It came right up to, the kingdom of Judea actually starts here and then only went up to about here. That's all the further the kingdom of Judea was under the Romans. It included Judea and then Samaria and Galilee, right? But then from Judea south, the Sinai, and then this part of the northern Arabian Peninsula and a big chunk of what would be called modern Jordan was the kingdom of Nabatea, right? And Herod's mother was Nabatean. So his father was an Idumean, his mother was a Nabatean. So there is not a drop of Judean blood in Herod. He can never possibly be the legitimate king of the Jews. So now we have to fast forward to 3 BC, 2 BC, 1 BC, when Jesus has been born, and the Parthians back over here in Mesopotamia in the house of Magistanes, they are starting to take note of signs in the heavens, because as we talked about, the house of Magistanes had 3 primary responsibilities. They interpreted dreams, they read the stars, and they oversaw royal succession, as well as they also gave a daily intelligence briefing to the king. Now, it's very interesting that Herod established his kingdom in 37 BC. Also in 37 BC, the Parthian king, Phraates IV, murdered 30 of his brothers to obtain the throne. So he is a tyrant in Parthia, and he is every bit the tyrant that Herod is. And there were actually Parthian refugees that fled the central part of Parthia and fled to the Roman province of Syria, seeking, you ready for this? Seeking Roman help to overthrow Phraates. I mean, so this is just this crazy soap opera of God Save the King, of who is going to be the king, who is going to be the ruler of the world. But starting in July of 3 BC, the Parthian Magi start to observe these very interesting signs in the heaven that we will cover at another time, where they are led to believe that a great king has been born in Judea. And so it starts on July 29th of 3 BC. It lasts a little over a year until October of 2 BC is when the series of highly condensed celestial events ends, and they determine the House of Magistanes convenes. They are overseeing royal succession because guess what? Phraates dies. Phraates dies. So now, as we talked about before, they oversee royal succession. It's not automatically Phraates' son who's going to become king. They've got to consult the genealogies. They've got to consult the stars. They've got, if any of them are having dreams, they've got to determine who the next king is going to be. And although we can't say so for certain, isn't it provocative that they make a trip to Judea to investigate the birth of a great king and says, we have come to worship him? So in other words, have they come to frankly offer Parthian loyalty to this new great king? But this is what sets the stage for they, like I said, because this is Parthian territory, this is Roman territory up in here, and then you've got Judea being administrated for the Romans by Herod. They are traveling into Roman territory. So this is an official ambassadorial entourage with military escort. They would have had to have traveled that way for both protocol, but then also for protection, right? And like I've said before, I believe they would have traveled up the Euphrates River until they got to Rasafa. At Rasafa, they would have crossed the Euphrates and picked up the King's Highway, where they would have come as far south as Damascus. Also, by the way, I called it Antioch last week. I meant Damascus. Once they hit Damascus, either Herod's own men rode to Jerusalem and notified Herod, or the Parthians themselves sent advance riders to Jerusalem to notify Herod. They then went to Caesarea Maritima first because that was Herod's administrative capital, and then realizing he wasn't there, then they would have gone to Jerusalem to meet with Herod in Jerusalem. And this is why it says, and Herod was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him, because a Parthian army showed up on the doorstep of Herod's kingdom, demanding, where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have come to worship him. And that is why this is such an amazing, amazing story, is because Herod has had to obtain his kingdom by driving the Parthians out 35 years earlier. He fought a long, bloody war with Roman help to drive the Parthians out because, hey, I'm the real king because the Romans have said so. But now the Parthians are back, and they are back at the head of an army with military escort. And we know who the Magi are. They are king makers. That is what they do. That is their job description. And they have just walked right into the court of Herod the Great and said, oh yeah, by the way, where's the legitimate king? Because we know you are not him. We know that you, Herod, okay, You are not the legitimate king of the Jews. You are a pretender. You're a Roman client king. You're an Idumean. There's no possible way you could be the legitimate king of the Jews. And we are here to worship him. And that is why it says, once again, in the Gospel of Matthew, that Herod was greatly troubled and all Jerusalem with him, because they think that the Parthians are there to start another war over the throne. So that's where we've got to wrap it up today. That's one of my favorite parts of telling the story, because it helps us understand why this entire thing is called God Save the King, is because Herod was a pretender. He was a tyrant and a pretender, right? And was a tyrant who ruled his throne by muscle and by appointment. He wasn't a legitimate king. But meanwhile, in a small little backwater town south of Jerusalem, God has quietly birthed his son and the Mashiach Nagid, the rightful, true Davidic king of Israel and the king of the world, right in Herod's backyard. So I really want to thank you for joining me today. My name is Tim Keyes. I am the host of God Save the King. Please join me every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. God save the King.